Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, December 13th, 2023, and this week on the Roundup, we're going to be answering 3 questions that we've been hearing from international educators over the last few days. Before we get into those questions today and our normal welcome, I do want to give an incredible shout out to the literally dozens, if not hundreds of you that have reached out over the last 7 days since the awful events that unfolded on UNLV's campus where I work on February 6th, on December 6th. 3 faculty members were killed, a 4th critically injured, and our campus has been reeling, the darkest day in UNLV's history. So thank you, all of you, for reaching out over the last few days to express your support, your condolences. Just for those that I met last week, thankfully I was in Phoenix at the AIRC conference last week with my tribe. And that's a message that I've been reinforcing since then, that we need to all find our tribe in our profession. Those folks that get you, that you know you can contribute to the greater good of that organization and our profession. And hopefully you're all members of your own tribe. Hopefully you're part of my tribe as well, because I can tell you last week was rough. Being away from campus, not being with my colleagues on campus to grieve with them, to go through this together. It's hard. I'm a remote employee. I get out there once every quarter, so it's been a real challenge. And I had many moments last week where I was tearing up explaining a story that I'll share with you today. My 13-year-old son had the opportunity when I called him that night, video chatted with him to share. Hey, I wanted to tell him this story about what had just happened on campus today, because that's a big deal, and he needs to know about it. He's 13; he can handle it. I told him the story. He could tell I was getting pretty emotional, and at the end of that, he asked, "Dad, can I give you a hug?" And it's that obviously chokes me up and melts my heart when I tell that story every time. But the literally dozens, if not hundreds, of folks who've reached out through email, through text, through WhatsApp, through in-person contact last week in Phoenix, your presence with me, your understanding is so much appreciated. And I've shared that with my colleagues back on campus about how important it was for me to have that group of people that I was with last week to lean on in a very dark hour for our institution. So thanks all for being a part of that conversation who have reached out over the last few days. So let's get right into the questions of the day. As you may know, for those that are new to the Roundup, we take our news stories from a newsletter that we put out every Monday across our social platforms. It's called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And that newsletter you can subscribe to on our, if you prefer an email version of it, you can subscribe to it on our website, and I've dropped the link in the chat. But for those who are listening to the audio-only podcast, the website link is smieconsulting.org/subscribe, and then you'll be able to drop in your details in the subscribe link to get that email if you want it in your inbox every Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern. If you prefer LinkedIn as your main news source for international education, there is a LinkedIn version of that newsletter, and I'll also be dropping the link to that in the chat as well. So it's a newsletter that I've really, I'm very grateful for the response. And every time I go to a conference, I always have folks come up to me and say, "Thank you for your newsletter. Thank you for your live chats. They really mean a lot." That's my go-to place for news on international education, and that just means the world. And I appreciate those of you who have taken the time to subscribe either on LinkedIn or through the email version. We now have almost 1,600 subscribers across both versions. So I'm very pleased that so many folks in our industry are getting this news every week. And these are top social media stories that impact international education and how we recruit, and webinars coming up, AI conversations, all those kind of tech, digital things that we deal with every day in our jobs. And then a set of news stories on what are the top line news in the United States impacting international education, solutions that I see coming up through to the surface through some of these news stories, and then a global roundup through major destination markets on how they are grappling with various international education issues. So that's the newsletter version that you get on Mondays. Here on Wednesdays, we take a look at those news stories and find what the common themes are that we had develop in those articles that we publish out. And we come up with the questions or themes that we use here today on the live chats. And we know most folks aren't able to do the live chats because we're all busy people. I've been there, I've done that, I'm doing that. So that's why we make sure it's archived on our YouTube channel, and as well, if you want the video version, as well as an audio-only podcast that we're pleased to say has over 3,100 downloads. So very proud of what we've been able to accomplish through our work here on the Roundup and on the newsletter. So let's get right into our three questions of the day. First up is, how is Education USA supporting international education efforts? Now, for those who've known me for more than a minute, you know I am always a big cheerleader for Education USA. I worked for them for 6.5 years in DC as the first marketing coordinator for the network, developed the website, that content that you have today. We started all the EduUSA social media channels on the global scale back in 2009. We developed Your 5 Steps to U.S. Study during my time at Education USA, working at IIE. And one of the things I'm most proud of through my time at Education USA for the higher ed folks is the development of what we called not only the EduUSA Forum, the in-person event that Education USA now hosts annually, other than when NAPS is in DC, is the EGG. That's what we came up with. That was our acronym that we used to describe the EGG. And the EGG is the Education USA Global Guide. And this is something we began back in 2010. At the same time, we launched the first Education USA Forum in DC back in 2010. We're in a hotel basement. I think we got a couple hundred people. We were really excited about that. But one of the things we wanted to have and give to attendees that could be a great resource for them was what we affectionately called the EGG, Education USA, a Global Guide. When we talk about resources for U.S. higher education folks that are in the student recruitment side of the shop on international ed, this is what, when I first came up with this idea and we proposed it to the state and we developed the content for it, I wanted this to be something that was complementary to Open Doors. I wrote a blog about it. You might have seen in the newsletter last week about comparing SEVIS by the numbers data, which is current year real-time data from October, versus the Open Doors report. That is the previous year's academic data from international students that was released in November. So there was a blog about that. But I've always seen Open Doors as an essential resource for understanding the trends that have been happening in student flows to the United States, the academic programs, primary sources of funding of students, where they're coming from, obviously, in the world, and charting that over time. And recently they've added in the last 6 or 7 years, added in the new international student enrollments from the previous academic year as well, which has added another layer to important data that we need to track, which we saw during the pandemic was took some significant dents. But they've also added in their fall snapshot survey to try and get some kind of a snapshot of what's happening in the current year, current fall term, right before they released the Open Doors from the previous academic year's data. So it really is important data to have, and a resource that you want to have. I've always called it sort of kind of, if you're looking at resources for international student recruitment planning, the Open Doors report is kind of one. And number two, I think it's less interpretive in terms of what it gives you, but the SEVIS by the numbers is probably number two. but on that list. But 1A is what we tried to do with the EGG back in 2010, and that's to provide the context of what's happening on the ground in the 6 State Department world regions and in specific countries that are highlighted for obvious reasons because they're major senders to the U.S. You find the kind of details about what social media strategies or platforms are working in those countries, what the top best suggestions are for in-person recruitment versus digital recruitment. It really gives you the layers of data analysis of what's happening in each region within the Education USA network, so you can have a sense of, well, is this the right strategy here, or do I need to shift gears and maybe do something different in another region? So I think there's all sorts of value with the EGG. It's developed, and to be honest with you, the content that's created each year comes from the REACs. Or now their REACs have done what NAFSA's done and what AIRC just did last week. Their acronym now stands for nothing. So REACs are now REAC, regional manager. So the REACs do all the hard work for the EGG, frankly. The EGG is, as a shout out to my colleagues on the REAC side that I know and love deeply. Had a great opportunity to run into Melissa Deschamps in the Middle East, based in Qatar, and Lisa Moroni, based in Kenya. At AIRC last week. It was great to see them both. But my regional manager friends in Education USA, the REACs do all the legwork for writing the content for that for the EGG each year and in those regional sections. Obviously, the team at IIE and DC compiles all the analysis from all the data from the website, from social media to kind of provide the U.S. higher ed audiences a really solid piece of contextual data and analysis by the REACs and trend data on what's happening on the ground from their advising centers. So you have a good sense as a U.S. higher ed rep what is happening in each of the regions and markets that you're looking to get more active in or engage less in, depending on where you are in the world. So the EGG has become, over the now 13, 14 years that it's been around, a really essential complement to Open Doors. And I'm really happy to see that going strong. They just released it, the 2023 edition, this past week. Normally it's released during the EduUSA forum in the summer, but obviously they didn't have one, so that got pushed back a bit. But the forum is... the EGG has really become that kind of go-to resource if you're looking for really what's happening on the ground in particular key markets from an Education USA perspective. And I've dropped the links to the actual PDF of the global guide that's online, as well as the master site for past year's global guides. So hopefully you get a chance to download your copy. The other resource that I think is very important, Education USA, when we first started, I started working there in November 2008. There wasn't really an organized higher ed outreach other than REACs and advisors doing campus visits, and there was a team at State Department that selected the advisors to go on trainings and visit campuses before they went to major conferences. But there really wasn't a coordinated approach to higher ed outreach, and we started doing attending. Myself and others from IIE would attend the regional conferences at NAFSA regularly. I know advisors had done that and RICs had done that for years, but we provided that kind of support mechanism to enable all the travel, all the goodies that we needed to have at the conferences, to have much more intentional presence at all the major international ed conferences throughout the year, as well as the other associations that have significant pieces of their membership that are involved in international. So we set up real strong structures in place and started doing outreach. I was since I had a background in social media, I was working with our advisors to teach them how to use social media to reach not only their students in their countries, but also to reach higher ed folks. I started working with the state consortium in different states around the country, since I had been involved in Indiana with Destination Indiana, and I went to at least a dozen states in the course of my 4 or 5 years where that was a priority, visiting with them, helping them get understanding their needs, seeing how Education USA can help and how we can promote their events through our network. So there was some real collaboration happening as a result of that, connected institutions in the United States directly with our EducationUSA advisors and REACs out in the field. So that was back in late noughties, early teens, but since then, the team at IIE in DC, along with the State Department program officers and REACs, and all have become much more intentional about with the services that they're providing. And one document that just dropped in the chat is that they have a newsletter that comes out monthly. They just released a new document as part of that newsletter called U.S. Higher Education Resources. And it's not the flashiest of documents, and that's fine, but it does give the content that really helps you understand where EducationUSA is as an organization, as a part of the State Department, and what its current mission and goals are, and how they are as a network providing services for U.S. higher education institutions. They've had, obviously I mentioned the Global Guide, they've had their fairs and forums, regional forums, as well as DC forums, events around the world for decades, or at least 2 decades. But now they have also a new series. They've had seminars for a while, but they've also launched what they call EducationUSA Dialogues. And these are aimed to broaden and deepen their outreach domestically to the higher ed community, focusing on 2 themes, according to this document: increasing the number of and broadening the diversity of U.S. higher education hosting students, institutions hosting, HEIs hosting international students, and 2, ensuring the quality and success of on-campus experiences for international students. So that second one is certainly newer. And that first point, though, I do want to come back to that, because when I always talk about perspective on what's happening in the wider world and how we are or are not set up for success as a country compared to our competition. We've long lamented the lack of a national international education strategy in the United States, and we're going to talk more about that in the second question of the day, but when we get to the U.S. for Success Coalition. But what EducationUSA has really done is shine a light with that shift in I don't know if it's new, but it's certainly a shift in emphasis in terms of how they're talking about it with this dialogue series, is that we have so much more capacity than the rest of, other than potentially China, so much more capacity to host international students than our major competitors for these same students. You look at Canada, there are literally 400 post-secondary institutions. Most of them, more than half, 60-70%, are vocational colleges. There's 100 plus college, actual university level organizations as well. But they have almost over 800,000, maybe 900,000 international students at that few of a number of schools. That's just unsustainable to grow as much as they are. They are all 30+%. Some of the private vocational colleges are up to 60-70%, maybe 90% in some cases. And a couple of those have closed in recent years just because they're so heavily dependent and really were just money-making machines for whoever those private vocational college owners were, rather than quality educational pursuits. So you now have a situation in Canada where of their 800,000 plus international students, over half are at vocational colleges, and the rest are at the university level. So they are chock-a-block full. There are, and you look at the institutions in British Columbia, in Ontario, in Quebec, they are the 3 major provinces that see the greater majority of international students, probably 80% or more. And they are at capacity, if not surpass capacity. And the Canadian government is now ratcheting back. They're talking about caps. They're talking about, they've just now increased the amount every international student has to have to show to get a study permit. It went from only $10,000, regardless of how much the institution costs, for goodness sakes. You wonder why there's been so many issues with students at food banks and in tend to an apartment. It's just unsustainable. They never really had the money that they needed to succeed. But they've just raised it from 10,000 minimum up to 20,000. That'll get rid of some of the less serious students, hopefully, and Canada's numbers will, I think, contract. As you see in the UK, we're going to talk more about them at the end, but their government has really changed some major significant policies over the last last few weeks and months, and maybe more on the horizon. So they're looking at a potential contraction. We'll talk about why in a minute. But you also see in Australia, they're talking about net migration limits and reducing by half the number of number of migrants they allow into the country, and students are counted in those numbers as well. They're tightening up restrictions on work, on the routes that students can take, and the visa processing piece. So there's some major contraction about to happen in Canada, UK, and Australia. And all three of those countries, they have minimum percentage of international students on their campuses of at least 25%. That's an average across their institutions. Some of them are upwards of 40, 50, 60% international in the UK, in Australia. Australia has less than 40 universities and probably another 100 or 200 vocational colleges where they do well too, like Canada. But they are at capacity. And when I say capacity, they're not 100% international in most cases. But what they are at capacity in is a tolerance amongst the public for more. And keep getting more and more and more. And that's happening. And you see the housing issues that have sprung up, certainly during the pandemic, they became absolutely devastating topics on a lot of college campuses and in communities where these colleges are located. But now there's knock-on effects now where those housing issues that popped up during the pandemic are now really a real barrier to further growth in a lot of these key markets. There were UK universities saying, don't come if you don't have housing already sorted before you get on the plane. So that kind of puts you off. So you wonder what the long-term sustainability of some of these countries are. But in the U.S., we're only at 5.5% international amongst our entire higher education population in the U.S. And granted, 60% of the international students are probably at less than 10% of the universities that can host international students. But there are so many more quality institutions that have capacity to grow. And that is across the board, not just in the elite universities in the United States. So I think EducationUSA's shift to diversify where international students go is a solid one. And in terms of the outreach that they can do to U.S. higher education institutions that maybe are just starting the process or thinking about becoming more international, what they need to build to get to a point where they can host regularly larger numbers of international students. That's the real challenge, but I'm glad to see EducationUSA moving in that direction. So next up, related topic, we talked about the U.S. for Success Coalition. I talked about it at the CAIE conference last month, where we had Fanta Ah as one of our plenary speakers in a conversation with someone from Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, talking through what the coalition's mission is. And I had an opportunity to ask Fanta a question about that. And it's become clear that they're trying to do things differently than what had traditionally been the roles of advocacy efforts that NAFSA did separately, that the President's Alliance did separately, that the Alliance for International Exchange did separately. There wasn't a lot of coordination amongst those three. Those are probably the three biggest ones, and I'll put in International ACAC, NACAC in there, that had some advocacy work on the Hill where they really spent time visiting with the elected representatives, giving them their spiel about why that we needed their support for what had been in the 80s and 90s a white hat issue on Congress. And that means it's very much a bipartisan issue. And it is to a certain extent in terms of the funding. There's always funding battles, but they usually have come out on top in terms of being pro international education. But previous administration threw a lot of ashes onto a fire that has sparked, and particularly with respect to China, with Muslim nations, and the previous administration's first executive orders. So there's been a lot of turmoil in the industry, frankly, about does the U.S. really want international students, at least politically? There's growing concerns in certain parts of extremes on the right that saying that international students, well, we're taking jobs away from Americans, and that's not the case at all. Americans aren't being trained in numbers high enough to fill those jobs that these international students and immigrants that come to the U.S. are filling. So that's a whole long conversation about this. But the U.S. for Success Coalition, the question is, are they going to move the needle on when it comes to the move primarily towards a more welcoming country and more welcoming policies, and to eventually towards a national strategy for international education? Kind of what the EducationUSA Forum 2 years ago announced the joint statement in support of international education. This was a intradepartmental or interdepartmental approach involving State Department, Commerce, Homeland Security, and Education. Probably want to include in the future Department of Labor in there when we're talking about developing coherent policies that can tie students into direct pathways to becoming employees and workers after they finish their studies, and eventually permanent residents and citizens. So long journeys, obviously, that I went on when I came to the U.S. almost 50 years ago as a 5-year-old. I was an L2, intercompany transfer dependent. I didn't become a citizen until from age 5 till right before my 18th birthday. It took me that long to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. So one of the goals of the coalition is in developing this international ed strategy is having components of that strategy that make the U.S. more welcoming, more transparent, more clear-cut routes that students can rely on and families can rely on that might be looking to come here for study and then eventual residency. That process is very complicated. The Success Coalition really is it's a first time to really gain momentum behind this kind of national strategy in developing the pieces that we need. And part of that is it's not going to happen all the way from the ground up. It needs to happen from top down. There has to be White House buy-in in order for it to be effective, because all this joint statement on principles supporting international education did is it lit a fire under each of the departments, State, Commerce, Homeland Security, Education, to establish kind of working groups to talk about how they can be improving what they do to improve to provide a more welcoming environment for for international students bound for the U.S. What's ended up happening is they all do their own things in their own departments, but there's no mandates from the top to say you need to work together and develop new policies, do new procedures, advocate for legislation. And that's really the piece that I think and hope is the real missing piece that we need to move forward with a national policy, is that it has to be legislation that does things that stamps green cards onto PhD graduates, that allows for the F1 status to be considered dual intent so that they don't need to prove a negative when they go for their visa interview, that they're not planning to become an immigrant to the U.S. At age 18. Who does that? And it's to have that plan for their life at the time they go for their visa interview, that they have to be able to convince that officer that they're not planning to stay in the U.S. once they get here. These are the things that this coalition, I think, can help advocate for the couple of those things I just mentioned, the green cards for PhD grads, to streamline that process, to make the pathways much clearer for those that want to stay and work in longer term beyond OPT and potentially H-1B. What can this coalition do? One of the things they have done is they've just addressed to DHS a series of recommendations to DHS to improve what they call concrete recommendations that Jill Ann Murray, who's a Deputy Executive Director of Public Policy at NAFSA, that they had discussions with the DHS working group there and launched these recommendations to them to make clear what's needed to happen as we move towards an international education strategy for the United States. So it's a first step. It's not the end step, and it's a long road ahead, but it's certainly one that was much needed. And the challenge will be, this is a conversation that they're having with DHS, that these recommendations are specifically for that. That there are going to be similar ones for state, there's going to be similar ones for commerce, similar ones for education, maybe for labor as well. But the real significant movement that needs to happen won't happen until there's White House level support and political capital spent on the kinds of legislative changes to our system, which have been bogged down in committees and the real changes we need get thrown into bills, but then they get become part of these omnibus bills that get hacked to pieces and really never see the light of day. So we've needed urgently immigration reform for over almost 40 years now in the United States, since the 80s when we last had a really significant change. We've painted around the edges a little bit, but we've not addressed the bigger picture. And that's something that this national strategy needs to have as part of the legislative change that needs to happen to really see, I think, landscape changing, game changing, seismic shifts in our policies in the United States towards international students and international education in general. So it's a long road ahead, but it's certainly one that I think we're going to see hopefully some positive signs. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the U.S. for Success Coalition, and hopefully eventually get White House level support for something and political capital spent to make the real change that we need happen. And the final question I'll touch on briefly today is the U.S. international student gravy train about to end? And oh my goodness, can I tell you what, this last week in terms of the news stories, having been at an international ed conference where we had a number of British colleagues that were presenting and having conversations about this, they are worried. They are really worried for the short term. They were already dealing with the elimination of the dependent visa for non-doctoral students coming to the UK. That expires at the end of December this year, so no new international students with dependents will be allowed into the country after December 31st if you're not a doctoral student. That impacts two of the UK's top markets for postgrad studies. That would be Nigeria and India. And they are already starting to see significant damage to their numbers. Then you have to add insult to injury to that. We now see the Home Secretary, the new Home Secretary, who took over for Suella Braverman, the new Home Secretary cleverly is now proposing a potential review of the graduate route. Now, for those who aren't aware, the graduate route is the UK's version of OPT. And they have, in 2012, it was eliminated under the Cameron PMship. David Cameron, who oddly enough is now back in the fold in the cabinet as the education minister. So that was eliminated in 2011-12, and now it was reinstated about 3 or 4 years ago, right before the pandemic, and that has been allowed international students to switch over to work visas right away after they finish their studies. That might be going away or be severely curtailed. So there's a lot of worried faces. They put on a brave face, as the Brits always do, in terms of their public personas. They're always talking positively. Oh yes, the quality of brand UK is solid, and there's no doubt in terms of that. And services provided, they've improved, blah blah blah. But the reality is these changes that the government has made to curb net migration, to address the challenges with housing and with NHS, their health service in the UK, being stretched to the limits by all these extra international students and their family members, has real negative long-term consequences for prospective students looking at the UK, particularly for postgrad master's level studies. So that gravy train could be ending, at least for the short term and to the next couple of years. But any changes, and the changes that is most likely to happen, will come with elections that may be called by the end of 2024. maybe sooner. And if that happens, the general opinion is that the Conservatives will be out and Labor, hopefully, or Liberal Democrats will be in, one of the two. Maybe a coalition, depending on how the numbers shake out. But those other parties that might take over would have a much more sympathetic view to international education. So we'll see. But for the short term, the UK will numbers in one of the articles I posted. A couple of them actually have some data from Enrollee, which handles a lot of the visa processing for data for the UK universities. They're showing 40, 50, 60% drops in deposits and confirmed students coming in January. So there's some real damage about to be done in the UK. So we'll see how long that lasts for them. Hopefully not too long for my colleagues across the pond. That's all we have for you today on the Midweek Roundup. Thank you all for your well wishes about UNLV Strong. We so appreciate all the support we've been getting. We're about to have a memorial on campus today for the 3 faculty who were killed, and we appreciate your continued thoughts and prayers for the healing that needs to happen on our campus. So until next time, have a great day.